We're going to be looking at how to add decals to your car, such as this. We'll be going over the process of UV unwrapping and then adding decals such as this. And we'll also cover how to create your own decals and then add them to the car just like I've done here. For adding the decals to the car, of course, we're going to be using Blender. To create our decals, I'm going to be using Krita. Krita is a free program, so if you don't have it, you can download it for free. Other programs such as Photoshop or GIMP will work just fine. It just may be a little bit harder to follow along if you're using a different program. However, you can use any program you want to create decals, so it's not necessary to use Krita. It just may help to follow along if you're using the same software as I am. The first step is going to be to get a car model. If you have one of your own car models, you're welcome to use that. If you don't have your own car model, you can always download mine. You can use this link, or there will be a link in the description which will bring you directly to this page, and then you can scroll down some, click on the download button, you will need a login, so if you don't have an account on Sketchfab, you will need to make an account and then log in, and you will be able to download this model. Once you have downloaded the model, it will be in a zip file similar to this. You're just going to right click on it and then choose Extract All. If you need a program to help you open zip files, 7-zip is the one that I use, so you can download 7-zip. It is free as well. It will work on Windows 10 and possibly other Windows operating systems as well. So you're just going to click Extract All, and then you'll have a normal file similar to this one. And once you have the normal file, you can delete the original file. And then you're going to want to move this file to somewhere where you normally save your Blender stuff. I save mine in my art stuff and my Blender stuff and then cars. And for this specific one, I created a folder called Decal Tutorial just by right-clicking and doing New and choosing Folder and then naming it Decal Tutorial. And then inside this, I dragged the Aston Martin DB10 file. This is the file that you'll get once you extract. Once you do right-click and extract, you'll get this file. And it comes with the source and the textures file. I've also created a tutorial stuff folder by doing right click and new folder. You may want to do that as well so you can keep the original Blender file as well as the original texture that comes with the download. Once you have that, you're going to click on source and you're going to double click on this Blender file to open it. Going to turn on screencast keys so that you can see what I'm doing. If you don't have this as an option, it's okay, it's not necessary. The only purpose of this is to show you which keys I'm pressing. So if you don't have this as an option, yeah, you don't need to worry about it. It's not needed for this tutorial. The first thing we're going to need to do in order to add decals to this is to UV unwrap this model. And to do that, we're going to right click on this car to highlight it in orange, and then we're going to press tab to go into edit mode. When you're doing UV unwrapping, we use what is called a seam, and a seam is created by marking certain edges as being a seam edge. You can do that in either vertex select or edge select. Usually I will use edge select, so I'm going to select edge select. And for a car, the general strategy that you want to follow is you want to isolate the side of the car. You also want to isolate the front of the car, and you will also want to isolate the back of the car, the top of the car, and then the bottom of the car. And those will be the main areas that you want to be unwrapping as one piece. So we'll get started and you will start understanding a little more as we go along. It's not critically important which edge you decide to follow for the side of the car. You just want to make sure that it's continuous and it ends up blocking off one area or one complete area. So we're going to Alt right click, and that's going to select this whole edge loop here. So just do Alt and right click. And then you can hold Shift and select these edges here. And then we're going to do Alt Shift right click. And that's going to get down here. And for now, we're just going to click Mark Seam. This can be found under the Shading and UVs tab. If this tab is not open, then you just left click on Shading and UVs and choose Mark Seam. On this model, I have some pieces of the car that are physically separate from the rest of the car. This part is actually one of them, so I'm going to left click here and do Select Linked. That will select this entire piece, and we're going to press H to hide it. While we're at it, I'm going to hide the back pieces as well because these are actually physically separate. So I'm going to select one edge on this part, do Select Linked, press H to hide this, and then select one of these bottom edges here, do Select Linked, and press H to hide that as well. So what we want to do is continue down here, continue over and along this part here. So we're going to select this edge, Alt and Shift, right click to get the rest of this whole edge loop. We can do Mark Seam. Now we want to select this edge. I'm going to press period on the number pad to focus in on this area so it's easier to move my view. And then we are going to select these two edges, Alt, Shift, and right click. This will select this entire edge loop. And then we can do Control. Control is another key you can use. And then right click, and that got the wrong edges. So if you ever select the wrong edges, you can do Control Z, and that will get you back to your previous selection. So we're just going to do Shift and then right click on these edges here, Alt and Shift, and right click. Before we go any further, we're going to do Mark Seam. And I'm going to select an edge down here, press period to focus in so I can get a better view. And I'm going to continue this across like this. So we're going to select these two edges. And actually looking at this, I think I want to go one further. So I'm going to select this edge and then shift select these edges here and do mark seam. That way we get the entire side here. And then we will select these edges. And I'm going to hold Control and right click to get these. And then Shift and right click to finish this off here. And then mark seam. You'll notice that this red line continues past here, which means we can remove this seam right here because it already continues down like this. So this one is unnecessary, so just select it with right click and choose clear seam, and you'll notice now it's no longer red. All of these red lines are an indication of a seam. It's just a visual representation to help you visualize where your seams are located. If we've done everything correctly, we can go to face select, select a face here, do select linked, and you should only get the side of the car being highlighted in orange. That's an indication that you have done everything correctly. This is what I mean by isolating the side. It's now completely isolated from the rest of the car. If we had done something incorrectly, for example, if we clear this seam here or clear any of the seams that were previously created, and then we go to face select, select a face, and either press L on the keyboard, which will do the same thing as select linked, or we can select this face and do select linked as we've done before. And you'll notice that part of the bottom of the car is also selected. That's an indication that we have done something wrong, or there is a hole in our seam. In this case, we know it's right here. So we just need to go to edge select, select this edge, mark the seam, and then that problem will be solved. So the side of the car is now done, so we can move on to the front of the car. So I'm going to go back to edge select, and we're just going to continue our lines and continue this bottom line as well. So from where this one left off, you're just going to continue. So right click to select, hold shift, and continue selecting here. At this point we can hold Control and then right click here, and now mark seam. Go to the bottom, select this edge, and we can possibly just hold Control and right click to get the rest of this edge, and I think if we do mark seam now, that should be fine. The bottom of the car is kind of getting in the way, so I'm going to go to face select, select this face, do select linked, H to hide, just to make sure that we actually got the correct vertices, and we did. Again, we're going to check to make sure we isolated this correctly, so we're going to select a face, press L, and we only get the front of the car, which means we've done it correctly. So now we can move to the back of the car, switch back to edge select, and we're going to continue this one on. So select here, shift select here, and then go to the center, hold Control, right click to finish off this part, and do mark seam. Since the bottom really doesn't connect to anything, we really don't need to add seams on this back part. but we could if we wanted to just for practice. So we can do this one since it connects down to here, and then hold Control, right click, and then mark seam. That will mark this seam on the back. Switch to face select, select a face, press L. If you have only the back selected, you've done it correctly. In this area, we also could have just continued it on like this instead. Instead of coming across here, we could have gone across here. It probably would have been better to go across here like this. So I'm going to select this edge, do mark seam, and I'm going to remove these seams on these two edges. So select this one, shift select this one, and clear seam. You can double check again to make sure that the back is indeed one piece. And now that we've done the side, the back, and the front, the top should be perfectly isolated as well. So we're going to select a face on the top, press L, and you should now have the entire top selected. Now that this is done, we're going to save this file before we continue. So we're going to go to File, and we're going to choose Save As so we don't save over the original file. So go to Save As. I'm going to press the up arrow. I'm going to go to my tutorial stuff folder, and I'm going to change this. So I'm going to left click here, left click and drag, press delete, and I'm going to type tutorial recording. You can name it whatever you want, but I'm going to name it this, and then save your Blender file. The next step is to unwrap the model. To do that, there are a couple ways that you can do that. We're just going to do a simple unwrap to start out, and we'll look at some of the problems that we can have because of the simple unwrap. But the benefit, of course, is that it's quick and we can just get started easily without too much effort. So we're going to left click on these diagonal pieces here and then drag to the left. That's going to open up a new window here. We're going to left click down here and change this to the UV image editor, and we get this here. To close this window, put your mouse in this area and press N. That'll give us a little more space to work. We're going to press A twice, and then we're going to press U and choose Smart UV Project. Leave the settings at default and press OK. So in order to add decals to this, of course, we're first going to need some images of decals to use. I've put a bunch of links in the description to where you can find the decals that I'm using, but you're welcome to use your own decals as well as create decals yourself if you want to. So I have a bunch of decals here that I've downloaded, and I place them in my references folder, which is inside my tutorial stuff folder. So in Blender, we're just going to go to this toolbar. If you need to, use the middle mouse wheel, click and drag to slide this over. And we're going to go to this texture area. We're going to click on New, and we can click Open, and then locate your references. So I'm going to go to References and select this first one with left click, and we can actually left click and drag to select all of these. just let go once you have all of them highlighted, and they will all be selected. And then click Open Image. Now if we click this picture icon, you can see that all of the pictures actually got uploaded at once. So we now have all of these pictures available for use. In order to put them onto our car, it's going to be easiest if we switch from edit mode into texture paint mode. So left click on edit mode, choose texture paint, and it's going to show up in white here. We're actually going to need a new texture spot for this car because I didn't create one. So I believe what we're going to need to do is go down here. Again, you can use middle mouse to move this. Middle mouse click will move this, and we can do the plus icon, and that's going to allow us to create a new texture. We're going to left click here, and we're going to call this UV texture. And then left click once, and then you can go on to this number here, left click and drag. If you drag in a downward direction, you can then select both of these numbers at the same time. So you just left click on the number, drag down, release the mouse, and now you can change them both at the same time. So I'm going to type in 2048 and then press enter. Notice how both of the numbers changed at the same time. We actually want this to be an alpha color by default. We do have the alpha box checked, but we also have to click on this black part. So left click, and you can see the alpha is at 100%, but we want to left click and drag until it's at 0. You should also see the checkerboard pattern here, which is an indication that we now have the alpha channel as our background. So now we can press OK, and we now have our new UV texture here. One thing you're going to want to do while we're in texture paint mode is go to options, and you should make sure size, color, and strength all have checkboxes. By default, I don't think they have checkboxes, so just make sure that they all have checkboxes. This will save the size, color, and strength whenever you're changing from one brush to another. I'm going to change this to material. So left click here, change it to material, and we're going to left click here and switch to the node editor. We should already have a bunch of nodes already here, but we're going to add a new node. So we're going to go to add, go to texture, and choose image texture. This is going to control all of the decals. It's going to be the image texture that has all the information for the decals, where they're positioned. So now that we have this node, you can just left click and drag it, or you can use G to move it around. And you want to position it in this area in relation to the rest of the nodes here. And just use G to move it if it's not in that position. Then you can left click here and type in UV, and then left click on our UV texture, which we created down here. It's a blank alpha texture right now. And now we have this UV image texture node selected. You can see that it's selected because of this orange border. So now we can paint on it. So we can go back to the 3D view, just left click here, choose 3D view. Make sure you are in texture paint mode. And now we can just left click and drag and then let go. You'll notice now we have a UV texture as our available paint slot, and that's a good thing. I'm actually going to change this back to solid view, and you can now see what we've drawn here. In my case, it is the flag. So if I click on this and go to brush texture, it's this flag here that got repeated across this area. I'm going to do Control Z to undo that. So now we have this paint slot. We can paint on this by going to Tools, and you can change your brush here. The brush you're going to want to use for this is Texture Draw, so left click on Texture Draw. That's the default brush anyway. When you're making a decal, when you're adding a decal, you always want to use a pure white color. That will retain the original colors of your picture. And in most cases you want to change your strength to 1, so I'm going to left click here, drag it to the right until it has a strength of 1. You can also change the radius of the brush right here. It's at 5 pixels. You can see it's fairly small. If I change this to 20 and press enter, you can now see the radius of my brush, which is the circle around my mouse, is larger than it was before. This is what it was. This is how it looked before, and this is after. You can also change your brush size by pressing the F key and then scrolling out, or just moving your mouse out, or moving it closer and then left clicking when you are satisfied with the brush size. And just press F again to repeat the process whenever you feel like changing the brush size. To start adding decals, we're going to scroll down here. We're going to left click on texture, and you'll now see our flag texture. Instead of tiled, the main thing you're going to want to use for adding decals is Stencil. So left click on this, change it to Stencil, and you'll now see the picture of the flag when you have your mouse in this area. If you move your mouse away, the flag disappears. In most cases, the image aspect will be incorrect when you first see your image here. So you want to click on this button, which will reset the image aspect to be correct. So now you can see our flag has the correct shape. So you always want to click image aspect before you try to do anything. In order to move this stencil around, we're going to right click. That's going to allow us to move the stencil around. To make the stencil smaller, you're going to hold Shift and then right click. This will scale the stencil. In some cases it will scale unexpectedly, like it won't scale the way that it's supposed to. I'm just trying to get it to do that so I can show you an example. It's not doing it right now, but I'm sure it will at some point. Okay, here we go. So now you can see that the flag is scaling in a very unpredictable way. We would not expect it to scale like this. I think this is a bug in Blender that happens once in a while, where it scales around the wrong axis, it seems. If this ever happens to you, in order to fix it, just click on the image aspect and it will reset it back to the way it's supposed to be. You can also do reset transform if you want, but that just makes it have the wrong image aspect again. So you have to click image aspect to get it back to the original. So use right click to move it, shift right click to scale it, and if you need to, reset the image aspect. Now we're going to put this flag anywhere on the car, wherever you want it. I'm just going to press 3 to go to side view so we have a perfect straight on shot of side view. I'm going to drag this over, use shift and right click to scale it down, and I think I'm going to try to put it over here. And I'm just using shift and middle mouse to pan the view like this. And shift and right click to scale the flag, and I'm going to put it right here, I think is a good spot. Make sure that your brush color is a pure white. You can always left click on this. Make sure red, green, and blue are both at 1, and this is at maximum strength. And then you can just left click and paint over the flag, and it will now show up in the image editor as well as on the car. So if I was to go down here and change this from stencil to one of these other options, that will hide the stencil, and we can now look around our car and we see we have the flag on both sides of the car. One thing you will notice with the UVs set up as we have them is that it's going to be mirrored onto this other side. However, the flag is not going to be in the correct orientation on this side. Because we painted it on this side, it's going to look correct over here, but it's actually going to be backwards on this side. The stars, of course, should be over here with the rest of the flag going this direction. We'll take a look at how to fix this a little bit later, but I did want you to be aware of it for now. So just to practice, you can change this picture here to any of the other pictures that we have. For example, this devil face. And then you'll see it over here in our texture slot. Change this back to stencil. The image aspect is of course messed up, so you're going to have to click image aspect to fix it. And then position it where you want it by using right click to move this. 3 to go to side view if you want to put it on the side. And continue using right click, shift and right click to scale until you're happy with it. And then left click to draw this in. Just make sure you draw around the entire area. Change this to a different type. And we now have our second decal on the car. Let's take a look at why we want to use a pure white. So I'm going to go back to the flag, change it to stencil, do the image aspect thing, and let's make this a pure black and see what happens. You can put this flag wherever you want. This is just an example flag. So place it somewhere on the car and then left click and draw over it just as you normally would. And now I'm going to go over here and change it from stencil to 3D or anything else is fine. And you'll notice it's totally black, because the black color overrides any of the color on this stencil. If we were to use a different color, so if I do Control Z here, and do a gray instead, and then we go back to Stencil and we try this again, and then we change this to something else. You'll see it darkened it from the original color. So if you want to keep the original color, you have to use a pure white. It will keep all of the colors as the original color. You can also experiment with different colors and see what will happen if you use a different color instead. So you'll notice in this case I chose blue, and it has given this image a blue tint. Although in some cases these types of things may be what you are looking for, there are cases where you will want to darken an image because you think it's too bright, and knowing this information will help you do that. But in most cases you want to use a pure white. So you're going to want to click here, left click, and drag until all of these are at 1, and make sure this is all the way to the top, which it should be if these are all at 1. So I'm going to Control Z to undo this, and feel free to try out any of these other decals here. Just change it to Stencil, do image aspect, and continue adding these to the car until you are satisfied. Another thing that's important to be aware of is when you're getting images, they need to have an alpha value for the background. They can't have a white, black, or any color background. It must be an alpha value in order for them to look correct once you put them onto the car. So let's take a look at an example of what happens when you don't have an alpha value for the background. This one here, this eye example, has a white background instead of an alpha background. We're going to click image aspect just as we would normally, and you can see that there's actually a white square around this. So let's see what happens when we add this to our car. Just pick a spot anywhere on the car, scale the eye down or up as necessary, and then draw it onto your car. And change this to anything else so we can take a look at this. And you end up with this border line, and of course you end up with this white background. So this is an example of a picture that you would not want to use. Or if you're going to use this picture, you're going to need to remove the background and make it a transparent background instead of a white background. Otherwise, you will end up with this border every single time. Now let's look at how we can remove decals from our car once we've added them in. In this case, we've recently added this eyeball, so we can use Control Z to remove it if we want to. Or we can use Control Shift and then Z to redo the action, which will put it back. So Control Z is undo, Control Shift Z is redo. But let's pretend we don't have Control Z available to remove this eye. How would we remove the eye if we can't do Control Z? Well, the rest of this is an alpha texture. So we need to make this eye back into an alpha texture. In order to do that, we're going to need to click this X to remove this texture. Go back to the top, and we need to change this blend mode from mix to erase alpha. So this now should say erase alpha. Keep your strength at 1. Go to the icon that you want to remove and simply start drawing over it. However, as you can see in this case, we're starting to remove some of the color from this rear view mirror here. So we're going to do Control Z to undo that. And we're going to enable this option, which enables face selection. And now we see all the different faces shown to us by these squares. And we can select the faces just as we would normally by right-clicking on a face, and you'll see it's now highlighted. Holding Shift and right-clicking will add more faces to the selection, or subtract them if you already have added them. You can also use C for circle select, and then left click and drag to continue adding faces. And then right click to get out of circle selection. And we're also going to need to add some of these lower faces as well, so just shift and right click to add them in. Now we will be unable to draw on anything that is not selected, so if we tried to draw up here, nothing would happen. But when we try to draw down here, we start to remove this eyeball from the side of the car. If you need to, press F to increase the brush size and continue drawing until the icon is removed. Then you can switch back from erase alpha to mix. You can left click here, choose your texture again, and you can go back to adding in different decals depending on what you would like to add to your car. For example, we could add in this picture here, change it to stencil again, and we probably want to get out of face selection mode, so we're going to left click here to turn it off. Choose the image aspect button. And this one I'm going to add perhaps to the back of the car here. And let's take a look at some other options that we have. So underneath these buttons here, which we have already talked about, we have this angle option, which allows us to change the angle of this image. So if we change it to 90, for example, you'll see that the image has rotated. Another way to do this rotation is with your mouse in this area. Hold Control and right click. You'll now see this value is changing. So that is Control and right click. This will allow you to rotate the image to the desired rotation. Once you are satisfied, you can left click and draw to put this image on the back of the car or wherever else you would like to place it. To reset the angle, you can left click here, type in 0 and press enter, and that will reset the angle, and you have it now set to place it anywhere else if you would like to. Let's take a look at what happens when we draw near the center of our model. Because our model is mirrored, you're going to get a different result from when you draw on the side of the car. So let's take a look at what happens when we draw near the center of the model. If we press 7 to go to top view, and you can bring it to the center on the roof, or if you want, you can bring it to the center on the hood of the car. As long as it's near the center, it should be fine for this example. I'm going to make my brush a bit smaller just to show this a bit better. So just press F to make your brush smaller if you want to. And I'm going to draw near the outside edge first. And we'll just take a quick look at it. So you can see now we have this wheel on the left and right when it's not really supposed to be like that. Back to Stencil. So you can see this wheel here is supposed to be down here. And if we draw closer to the center, now you start to get a strange look. It may look kind of cool, but it's not exactly what you may have expected. So we'll just finish this off here. And we get an interesting result, which does not look the same as this. So when you're dealing with a mirror, and when the UVs are mirrored just like they are, you may not get a result you're expecting when you're drawing towards the center line, because anything that's drawn on the right side will be repeated on the left side and vice versa. You can try a few different pictures if you would like to try to get a better idea of how this affects your model or your drawings. For example, this dragon here, change it to stencil. You'll see it looks like it's actually, there's no picture here, but that's because the dragon is black. And Blender always shows the alpha in this picture as being black, so it looks like there's nothing here, but when you go over to this area and right click to move the image, you can now see the dragon. So again, we'll try this center line and we will see what happens. So you can already tell we're getting part of the picture in this area where it's not supposed to be. And we're going to end up with essentially what looks like a two-headed dragon in this case, which may be cool, but also not what you may expect when drawing near the center line. Some images are set up to work better with a center line mirror, and those images are the ones that are already essentially mirrored, and this one may be one that will work. So I'm going to click Image Aspect, and we'll take a look at this one. I haven't looked too closely at this, but I do believe that the left side is the same as the right side, but I could be wrong. Maybe there are changes. I'm just looking to see if I can notice anything different, but I think it's pretty much the same, if not exactly the same. So since it's mirrored, as long as we position it perfectly on the center, we could even check if we want to click this button. It'll give us a guide for where the center line is, and we'll try to center our picture with this center line, and then left click to disable this because we don't need it anymore, and just draw over the picture. So it wasn't perfect. You notice we now have two antennas here instead of the one that we're supposed to have. But the result looks a lot closer to what it was supposed to be from the original image, because it was essentially a mirrored picture to begin with. So it's going to show up pretty much as it's supposed to when you draw it on the center line. Another one that will look pretty much the same, I believe, would be this one. If we take this one and move it to anywhere on the center line, and I'm going to increase my brush size a little, and then just draw. Again, you'll notice it turns out the way that you would expect. So images that are appearing to be mirrored already will work fine on the center line. Images that are not intended to be mirrored will not have the expected result when drawn on the center line. Another thing to be aware of with these UV images or these image textures is Blender does not save them by default. So you're going to have to use the middle mouse and drag to go left a bit to get this here. And this star means that the image is not saved. So before we go any further, we're going to click on this, do Save as Image. I'm going to leave it as UV texture. You can name yours as UV texture if you want, and then click the Save as Image button. And we can also save the Blender file before we continue, so do File and Save. Now let's take a look at how to eliminate this mirror modifier and make it so that we can have the flag correctly represented on both sides, as well as having images such as these showing up properly even when drawn in the center. So to do that, we want to go to object mode, so we're going to change it to object mode. You're going to click on this wrench over here if you need to, middle mouse click and drag to move this options menu. Click on the wrench and click apply modifier. Now we're going to go to edit mode. Press A twice. How they're set up now, where it's only half of the car, only one side of the car, and only one side for everything else as well. Now we're going to press U while our mouse is in this window. Choose Smart UV Project. Use the default settings and click OK. And we now have a different UV unwrap. Mine looks a little weird for whatever reason. It looks a little squished, but I'm gonna just go with it, I guess. Just looks funny to me, but that's okay, because it's not using the full area, but that's alright. We're going to go back to texture paint, and we actually want this to be on the UV texture, and we want to go to this texture tab, and we want to click on this and make sure this is on UV texture as well. And I guess I just had to left click on this to fix it, to get it to update, I guess is what happened. So now you can see that all of our logos are in the wrong place. That's because we changed our UV texture layout. And I'm going to go back to edit mode and try this unwrapping process again. So now it looks like it's working a lot better. So I just did U Smart UV Project again, and I got a better result where it's using the full space. So now go back to texture paint, and you'll see our logos again. To get rid of these logos, we're going to go to Tools. We're going to change this from Mix to erase alpha. And instead of erasing the alpha on the car here, we're going to do it in this window. Just middle mouse click and drag this over. Change this from view to paint. You can press F to increase your brush size. Remove this texture by left clicking on the X. And then start painting in this window, and you'll see all of your decals disappear. Just make sure you paint over all of your decals to remove them. You shouldn't have any left at this point. Now we can click on the texture, choose our texture again. We're going to change it to the flag. Should be all the way to the top. And actually we want this to be on the UV texture still. And we want to change this from image texture to brush texture. And we can change this to the American flag, so now it should be the American flag. And we can click on image aspect to get it to be the right size. Again, we can press 3 for side view and position it similar to how we had it before. F to reduce the brush size. And then draw over the American flag, although it does not seem to be doing anything at this point, and that's because I have it on erase alpha. We need to change this back to mix, so this should say mix, and then go back to side view, position your flag with right click, shift and right click to scale, and then draw over it, and now it should be working properly. You can change this from stencil to something else, and you can see that the flag is on this side. However, it's not on this side this time because we removed the mirror. So we now have it correct on this side. If we want it to be correct on this other side, we're going to have to draw it again in a similar position. So instead of pressing 3 for side view like we wanted for this side, we're going to do Control 3. That's going to bring us to the opposite side. Change this to stencil. And then position it appropriately. Scale it as necessary. And then paint over it. And change this to a different option, and now we can see we have the flag on both sides with the correct orientation regardless of which side you're looking at. And let's also take a look at the center point again. It was a problem before, so we'll try the dragon. Change it to stencil, 7 for top view, and position the dragon similar to how we had it before, and then draw over it. So now this time you'll notice we're not having the same issue, and that's because we removed the mirror modifier and we did another UV unwrap. So this is a way that you can remove those issues of having the wrong orientation for either a flag or text. And you can also make it so you can draw in the center. The downside of doing this is now each of your UVs is taking up less texture space, which is actually going to reduce the quality or the potential quality of the images that you can add to this area. If it takes up more texture space, it'll be more detailed. Taking up less texture space means it's going to be less detailed. So if you were to draw just a simple line, for example, a 1 pixel line. I'll just do this as example. In this case, it's turning out okay because we're using a relatively high texture, 2048 by 2048. But you can see as I zoom in, instead of being a straight line, it ends up being a dotted line. And this is because the texture quality in this area is not as good as it would need to be in order for me to draw a line this small. And if we had the mirrored version, these would be bigger. These areas would be bigger. And it would be easier to draw more detailed lines such as this. We would be more likely to be successful because the detail would be higher on the mirrored version than it is on this version. So the drawback to this is the detail is not going to be as good as it would be if your UVs were mirrored. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to Control Z to remove these. And we're going to save this as a different Blender file because this is the one without a mirror. And we're also going to save this texture as a separate texture because this is the one without the mirror. So we're going to middle click and drag on this. Left click here, save as image. We're going to save this as UV texture without mirror. So if yours just says UV texture, change it to UV texture without mirror. And then save as image. And then we're going to File, Save As. And we're going to change this to tutorial recording without mirror and save as Blender file. So now you have one Blender file to play around with that does not have the mirror, and you can compare the other file that does have the mirror. Now we're going to take a look at creating your own decals or images to place on your car. Similar to what I've done in this picture here, these are decals that I've created on my own. I even have one where I created my own little racing logo here. And in order to do it, I'm going to use Krita. So open up Krita. And we'll do this one first. We're going to go to File and choose New. We're going to change the name from unnamed to Lightning Decal Tutorial. We're going to change this predefined option and we're going to put it at 2048 by 2048. And then we're going to click Create. We're going to choose our color. We can either use this selection area, just left click and drag this around the circle. If you want a red, you'll stop on red. And then you can left click here and drag this down to the red color. You can see the color right here of which color is active. The big square shows the color that you're selecting. We're going to change this to the Polygon Tool, so left click on the Polygon Tool. You want the size to be 10 pixels, so right click on Size, put in 10 and press Enter. Now we're going to use the Polygon Tool to create this lightning bolt, so we're going to left click here. Use these squares to give us a guide, so I'm going to left click on the top corner of one of these squares. Bring this over perhaps to here, left click again, And I'm looking at this and this is probably too small. So I can just press enter and then do Control Z to undo that. Maybe Control Z again. So I'm going to redo this, left click, drag it over, left click, drag it down, left click, bring it up, and just continue left clicking, following along similar to how I'm doing this. You can create a slightly different shape if you would like to create a different shape. Once you get to the end, you'll see this circle at the very beginning. When you hover over it, that means it's going to join to the beginning. So we're just going to left click with this circle. That's going to complete our lightning bolt. In order to fill in this area, if you want to fill in this area, you can click the bucket tool and left click to fill in the lightning bolt. If you would like an outer area the way that I did, you can go back to the geometry tool, and this time you're going to start a little left and a little above, and then left click, and similarly you're just going to go around the same way you did before, left clicking. And creating essentially an outline of the lightning bolt. I forgot to add in the little arrowhead, so we'll do that after. I'm just going to make sure to leave space to do that, so I'm making sure that there's going to be enough space in this area to add that in. And on my first one I went over like this, and then I came back and up like this until we are finished with our shape. If you'd like to fill in this area, go to the bucket fill tool. I'm going to change it to a black color. And before we do that, I want to add in my arrowhead. So to select this red color again, I'm going to hold Control and then left click to get this red color. Go back to the geometry tool. Use middle mouse to move this. Zoom in with the mouse wheel. And we're going to left click approximately in this area. Bring it down to the point, left click, bring it up, left click, bring it down, left click again, and then finally left click at the beginning. It's going to give us the little arrowhead. Switch to the bucket fill tool, left click here. You can see we have some areas that are still white. We can switch to the brush tool and just fill these in manually, removing any of the white that was previously there. We can make this a black color, switch to the bucket tool, and then left click in this area, and that will give us our lightning bolt. It looks more like an N in this case, but maybe that's what you're looking for. So if you want, you can go to File and Save As. If you're happy with this, we'll save it. We can save it as the lightning decal tutorial, that's fine. We can just click Save. This, however, saves it as a Krita document. It does not make a PNG or JPEG image. The preferred image type for making a decal is PNG, because PNG will retain this alpha value, whereas a JPEG will not. And as we've talked about previously, we're going to need this alpha value. So we want to make this a PNG, and we'll do that right now. We'll go to File, Export, and we'll change this name from Lightning Decal to, what did we name this? Alright, Lightning Decal Tutorial is what we want. So name it Lightning Decal Tutorial. And for the save as type, you're going to left click here, choose PNG. So it should say PNG image, Lightning Decal Tutorial. Click save. And then just leave all the settings. Store alpha channel, we'll make sure that we have this transparency. Click OK. To add this to our car, we're going to go back to Blender. And we're going to click on New, I guess, for the brush. Open. And go to wherever you saved your Krita document. I should have mentioned that I created a Krita's files folder here. This is where I saved my PNG as well as the Krita file. I would recommend you save it along with the rest of your references as well as the Blender files so that it's easier to locate in the future. So I'm going to go to my Krita files document or folder, and I'm going to choose my Lightning Decal Tutorial PNG, which is what we just created, and choose Open. You should now see it in the preview. And I'm going to change this color to be a pure white, so I'm going to left click here, change this to a pure white by left clicking and dragging these sliders to 1. Change the radius to something more reasonable, perhaps 50. And change this from 3D to stencil. So now we have our stencil. Choose image aspect to put it to the correct aspect. And if you want to, you could add this to the side of the car. Or if you want to, add it to any other part of the car. If you want to add it to the front, like I did in this image, this was created with the mirror. So it was mirrored on the left and right. It may be more difficult to create that effect since we no longer have a mirror, but press 7 on the number pad to go to top view. Use shift and the right mouse button to scale this. If it's scaling incorrectly, you're going to have to just set the image aspect back to the correct value and then scale this up again until you get what you're looking for. If you want to, hold Control and right click to rotate the image around until you are satisfied. Once you're happy, you can draw it in by just left clicking. If you want it on the other side, you're going to want a similar rotation value. But just drag it over, and you can either rotate it by hand or try to do the calculation as far as what it should be. I'm probably just going to do it by hand here just to save time. But you shouldn't need to scale it at all. However, I'm probably going to scale mine slightly because it's not fitting. And then just draw it in. It won't be a perfect mirror, like it was before. I think if we want to, we're going to have to flip this image in order to get it to be a mirror. I think we can do that possibly by adding negative values in here. So if we do -1 for the X value, you can now see it's a rotated version. Or it's flipped on the X-axis rather. So we can get rid of this by clicking this X, changing this back to the Erase Alpha brush, and removing this. Change this back to the Mix Blend mode. Get your texture back. Position it correctly. Scale it up slightly if you need to, because I scaled mine down slightly before. I'm just trying to get the correct rotation, and that looks close enough to me. It's not perfect, but now you can see it's much closer to being mirrored, not quite as perfect as it probably should be. So that's the downside of this, is when you don't have the mirror and you want it to be mirrored, it's going to be a bit more difficult to get it to look correct. But as you can see, eventually, with enough patience, you can certainly get it to look very close to mirrored, even if it's not. So we need to save this now. We can see this has a star, so we're going to do left click, save as image, save it as UV texture without mirror, and then save the Blender file by going to File, Save As. Make sure it's saved as the without mirror version, and then left click, Save Blender File. So far we've added decals to our car, but if we change to rendered view, you'll notice that our decals do not show up. The reason for that is we have not connected the nodes properly in order for the decals to show up on the car. So we're going to go to the node editor, so left click here, change this to the node editor, and you'll see this image texture is not connected to anything. That's part of the reason why we're not seeing any of our decals on the car. We want to add a few nodes to this image texture, and it's going to be easier if we use the Node Wrangler add-on. So we're going to just go to File, User Preferences, left click on the search bar, type in Node, left click, and then left click again to enable the Node Wrangler add-on. Close this once you're done. Right click on this and press G to move it up. Press Ctrl T. That's going to automatically add a mapping node and a texture coordinate node. This command would not have worked without the Node Wrangler add-on. These are going to be important because this is going to make sure that we are using the UV coordinates. Now what we need to do is somehow connect this up to this. And in order to do that, we want to mix between our original car paint shader and our decal texture. So we're going to need a mix shader. So we're going to right click on this mix shader, Shift D to duplicate, and bring this up over here somewhere. I'm also going to right click on this, press G and move this over so we have some more space. And then left click to confirm that you want to move it over there. So this is a color node or color output, and this is a shader input. So instead of bringing this directly to the shader, we want to bring this either into a diffuse, similar to this node here, or a glossy node, or we can even mix between the two, which in this case is actually the better solution. So we can either go to Add, Shader, and choose Diffuse BSDF. Or what we could have done is grab this and duplicated it. So we'll do that for the glossy shader. We'll right click on the glossy shader and Shift D to duplicate that. And just bring it over out of the way for now. And then press G to move it up here. And move your mix shader out of the way. Reposition them similar to this. So we want the image texture to go into the color. So left click on this circle, drag it to this circle. And the same for the glossy, so left click here, drag it down to the color on the glossy. And then we want to move this up. And plug these two into the mix shader. And we're going to need another mix shader, so we're going to do Shift D and bring this over here and bring this over here. So this one's going to connect in here, and this one's going to connect in here, and then this shader will connect into the surface. The factor that we want to use is the alpha value of our image texture. Wherever there is an alpha value, in other words, wherever there is no decal, we want to use the paint shader instead of the decal shader. So we want this alpha value to be the factor for this mix shader. I believe we're going to need an invert node because it's going to be incorrect if we don't. But we'll take a quick look in the 3D viewport. I'm also going to shift left click on this layer to activate all of my light sources here. And then we'll press render. This probably will not work. I'm just going to show you that it's not really working as intended. You can kind of see things, but the colors are obviously wrong. So we're going to go back to the node editor. We're going to click Add, and we're going to look for Color Invert, and we're going to place it here. Leave the factor at 1, go back to the 3D view, and try rendering again. So now we can see all of our decals in the render, and we can also see the car as well. Because we had a diffuse shader and a glossy shader, we will have some reflections on these decals, which is a good thing so that they're not as flat of a color. They actually will have reflections similar to how our car will have reflections. So that was the purpose of adding in this diffuse, glossy, and then mix, so that we have some reflectivity as well as diffuse color. From here you can still continue adding in decals, and they will automatically have the correct settings, whether they should have the car paint shader or the decal, will already be taken care of because of this node setup. So now we can save this by going to File and Save.